Pillars of Eternity 2 is Obsidian's third venture into reviving RPGs. After the high praise that Pillars 1 earned, I found myself quite excited for Pillars 2. With the addition of things like ship combat and reworked mechanics with the removal of things like endurance, this was looking like a pretty exciting sequel. But I have to say that not everything is perfect in this game. It's pretty good overall, but it misses a couple points. So starting off, the story begins with Aethys having reawoken, taking control of the giant Audra statue below the castle of Cad Nua, which causes all sorts of chaos as he begins sucking up souls and effectively killing people in many ways, removing them from their bodies. You're then quickly approached by the gods at the beginning prologue of the game, who set you off on a quest to find out what exactly Aethys is doing. They want to know why he's going to the Deadfire Archipelago and what he's looking for and doing there. It's honestly not the greatest story, and I do think it's a little bit worse than Pillars 1. The main campaign is only a handful of quests that are quickly run through, which is really disappointing, and it ends on a really disappointing note that feels more like a prologue to an actual story. There's also some plot holes that contradict things from the first game and call into question Aeora's history. Now, I'm not saying that the game can be beaten in like an hour, but it's pretty short, and overall the story isn't that long. What really lengthens the experience is the fact that there's so many side quests and things that tie into the main campaign. And this is one area where Pillars 2 goes really well. Many of these things tie into the story beautifully. Like Tyranny, there's a lot of choices and factions that kind of interweave throughout the main story. And in a lot of ways it does play a lot like Tyranny more than Pillars 1. For example, there's all sorts of different factions like the native Hoana of the areas who are natives that are being sort of pushed out and sort of having difficulties with how to deal with these new people that are trying to conquest their lands. There's people like the Rautai Empire and the Valian trading companies and the pirate factions and all these other interesting factions that really tie into the main story and give you a lot of choices. If you're a fan of Fallout New Vegas' approach, where they had all those different factions that you could interweave into the main story, then you're really going to like this aspect of Pillars 2 a lot. Probably the biggest change in Pillars 2 is the open world structure versus the more closed linear act-based structure of Pillars 1. Instead of Act 1 into 2 into 3, you're basically given a boat pretty quickly into the beginning of the game that you can go around and just explore anywhere. You can choose any direction you want to go. Some areas might be more difficult or less difficult than others, but you can basically sail anywhere. There's tons of different islands, even some that aren't even really claimed, that you can just name yourself, and there's all sorts of different interesting stories and things going on in them, though some of them do feel a bit padded. There are some that are quite literally just basically like a monster or two, or nothing really of any interest on them. I can definitely say though that there's more side quest content in this game than there was in Pillars 1's main game. And with that comes the new sailing and combat mechanics. So you basically get a little ship that you get to drive around. You can upgrade it with new things like cannons. You can get new crew members from taverns for stuff like deckhands, surgeons, and cooks. You can buy different equipment that has to be used for, like, for example, food and water. And this is very important because you have to keep morale in this game up, otherwise your crew will mutiny. And so you have to provide them with things like alcohol or better food to keep them happy, or by pirating people and sharing the loot. There's also a number of different ships you can upgrade to, with bigger ones, faster ones, getting things like more cannon spaces and so forth. All of these are pretty interesting and new mechanics that I did like for the most part, but the ship combat mechanic is just not that well thought out and very boring. It's basically done in a text-based thing, so you choose things like turning your ship, firing your cannons, going faster, slower, or repairing. It's just not that exciting, and really basically combat more or less comes down to either you choose to charge at the enemy ships that you can go into boarding, which then goes into normal Pillars combat mechanics with just two ships against each other on a map, and then you get all your normal characters with a couple deckhands and sailors fighting, or you actually fight the text-based ship combat, which is really boring and more or less just comes down to turning your ship, firing cannons, turning your ship, firing your cannons, turning your ship, firing your cannons. So you're basically just doing the same thing over and over again. And after the fifth time of reading the same exact dialogue that comes up and says, your ship moves X feet, your ship fires its cannons and does X damage, it's just really boring. And honestly, I was just skipping through all of it because I was totally uninterested. Which is a real bummer because ship combat mechanics should be pretty good given the emphasis in this game on them, with things like pirates attacking you or pirating people to get their loot, which by the way is really pointless because nobody cares if you pirate. There's no faction hit or anything. So you can just go around and pirate everybody and nobody cares. which makes the entire point of it kind of a little bit silly. Now moving on, you've got the new class system. You can basically do dual classing, so you don't have the top skills of a single class, but you can dual class. You can then mix skills and things from different classes, which gives you some interesting options. I did like it. They've also changed the normal combat quite a bit, so instead of before you had 6 people, you now only have 5, which does make the game a little bit less chaotic, which I did like. They've also made a pretty significant change to the health system. They no longer have that endurance system from Pillars 1, so your people recharge after each fight their health, which is a nice and a welcome change that keeps combat in the game moving. It is worth noting though that Pillars 2 is a little bit too easy, especially on higher difficulties. It just doesn't give you the same amount of challenge that the original game did, and this really comes down to some changes with the removal of the endurance system and also the fact that you can now just rest anywhere and there's no limited supply like there was in Pillars 1. So you can just carry a ton of stuff and just keep resting constantly to heal yourself to full health after every encounter, even in the middle of a dungeon, which kind of makes the whole thing kind of a little bit pointless because before, when you got hit and damaged, it was kind of a big deal. The only thing really limiting you in Pillars 2 now is the injure mechanic, but you can basically just sit there and rest again to get rid of that. I did run into a couple bugs that are worth mentioning in Pillars 2. For example, sometimes I had quests where it wouldn't trigger the dialogue, or an NPC that would just stand there and not talk to me or do anything, or a level I couldn't exit because the wall suddenly wouldn't let me use the exit door. There's all sorts of weird little quirks in the game, and it kind of feels like the game might be a little bit rushed though because there's so many of these that pop up. Another thing that I really like is that they've made the game 100% voice acted for all the characters in this game, which is really awesome. All of them sound great, from the gods to the random people you'll run into. They all sound very native and unique to their character and pull off fantastic performances. The only thing that isn't voice acted in this game is the non-story narrated stuff. So when it'll say something like Tausken walked forward and placed his staff, or curiously looked at this person, that stuff is not always voice acted. Only in the main story it is, and it's done by fantastic voice actors, which is a bummer that they didn't do all the other content as well, but it sounds fantastic when it is voice acted. They've also done a fantastic job in this game at removing the superfluous paragraphs of descriptions that you would find in the previous game. Sometimes you would get these long, drawn-out monologues from characters, or sometimes you get these long, drawn-out descriptions of every last single detail in a room that really were kind of pointless. And they've toned that down a lot, which is really great and made it a lot more concise, where before they might have used a paragraph to describe something, they now use a sentence or two in a much more efficient way. From the graphics department of this game, they've done a pretty good job at improving a lot of stuff. It's still that isometric look that you would have before, but it looks fantastic, and they've added in some neat additions with things like lighting and stuff that really makes the world feel a lot more alive, rather than kind of the painted look it had before, which I do really appreciate. Now overall, Pillars of Eternity 2 gets an 8.5 out of 10. I really want to give this game a 9 or a 9.5 out of 10 because I had so much friggin' fun with this game. It took me like 20 hours to get through the main story and a bunch of different side content that I did, and I had a friggin' blast with this game. But there's some things that just really hold this game back, like the main story that really lacks player agency, because you're more or less just following Aethys around as he does things without being able to really do anything or make many choices to affect that. Really, where this game does a fantastic job, as I said before, was in its side content. But some of that is also held back by the fact that there's so many bugs and random issues, and the ship combat in particular is just so bland that I just have no idea why they even bothered to add it in this game. But even with all these problems, the game is still fantastic. There's so much content here, and there's so many towns and places and quests and interesting people and locales. Just that there's a couple things that really hold this game back and really keep it from being as good of a sequel as it should be. But even with all those problems, I can still highly recommend Pillars 2. It's a great friggin' game.